You've seen the hats, the shootouts, the heroes and outlaws, but the real Old West wasn't what the movies told you. Behind the legends is a much grittier, more complicated story. Stick around, because these 10 facts are going to completely change the way you see the Wild West. Number 1. Cowboys didn't really wear cowboy hats. The image of the Old West cowboy has been largely shaped by early Hollywood films, advertising, and popular culture rather than historical reality. When people today imagine a cowboy, they typically picture a rugged figure wearing a wide-brimmed, high-crowned Stetson hat, usually paired with dusty boots and spurs. However, historical records, photographs from the mid to late 1800s, and first-hand accounts from the cattle drive era show that this iconic image doesn't hold up under scrutiny. In truth, most working cowboys before the 1870s wore whatever headgear was affordable, durable, and suited to the physical demands of the job. This included bowler hats, also known as derbies, which were particularly popular due to their snug fit that didn't fly off easily while riding, pork pie hats, flat wool caps, and sometimes even recycled military headwear from the Civil War. Head protection was important, but style wasn't the priority. It wasn't until John B. Stetson invented and began marketing his now famous Boss of the Plains hat in the late 1860s that a shift began to occur. His design, featuring a wide brim for sun protection and a tall crown for ventilation, quickly became associated with cowboy life, although it still took decades to be widely adopted across the frontier. For a long time, many cowboys stuck with their existing gear because it was cheaper and already broken in. The reason the Stetson became legendary had less to do with how common it was in the period, and more with the marketing success and cultural mythology that followed. It was pushed heavily in Wild West shows and later in Western movies, cementing its image in the public mind as the definitive cowboy hat. In practice, though, hats in the Old West were highly individual, repurposed, and based on personal need rather than any fashion standard. The reality is far more diverse and practical than the clean, uniform look we associate with cowboy heroes today. Number 2, outlaws were sometimes the heroes. In popular culture, the outlaw of the Old West is often portrayed as a merciless villain, a chaotic force opposing civilization. However, the reality of outlaw identity in the 19th century American frontier is far more nuanced and reflects deeper tensions within post-Civil War society, particularly in regions torn between expanding corporate influence and individuals struggling to retain autonomy. Many outlaws rose to fame, not simply because they broke the law, but because they symbolized resistance against systems that were increasingly viewed as corrupt or oppressive. Figures like Jesse James weren't just robbing for personal gain. They were, in the eyes of many, retaliating against institutions such as banks and railroads that were displacing families, taking land, and benefiting from political favoritism. Jesse's Confederate background added to his legend, painting him as a Southern avenger in a post-war society riddled with regional resentments. Communities that felt disenfranchised or economically exploited often saw him as a kind of avenger, even protector. This was reinforced by sensationalized media and dime novels that elevated him into a heroic figure, despite the violence he engaged in. The same applies to Billy the Kid, whose myth grew due to his youth, charm, and almost cinematic escape stories. In Lincoln County, New Mexico, Billy's involvement in the local range wars made him seem more like a pawn in a larger political game than a senseless killer. He was charismatic, fluent in both English and Spanish, and was known to help locals. Many viewed him as a casualty of corrupt local law enforcement and territorial politics. His multiple escapes from jail, especially the dramatic final one, cemented his reputation as someone clever and daring enough to outwit the system, which made him an appealing figure for a society that often felt powerless against growing federal control and economic monopolies. Lawmen themselves were often morally ambiguous, and their brutal tactics in pursuit of outlaws only fueled public sympathy for the latter. While not every outlaw had a noble motive, their stories resonated with everyday people who saw the West not just as a land of opportunity, but one of inequality and exploitation. This dynamic helped outlaws evolve from criminals into cultural symbols, with their image surviving long after their deaths, not because of their crimes, but because of what those crimes seem to represent in the broader context of a rapidly changing American frontier. Number 3. Shootouts were rare and usually not dramatic. The myth of the Old West being filled with daily shootouts and duels in dusty streets is a fabrication born out of entertainment rather than reality. In truth, gun violence in the American frontier towns was significantly less theatrical than movies and dime novels suggest. High noon standoffs, where two men slowly approach each other in silence before drawing weapons with flawless timing, were extremely rare, if they ever happened at all. Most actual shootouts were quick, chaotic, and driven by fear or desperation. Firearms were unreliable, often inaccurate, and the individuals involved were more concerned with survival than style. A confrontation that escalated to violence typically occurred in a saloon, gambling house, or behind a stable locations where disputes over debts, insults, or alcohol were more common than grand vendettas. These encounters lasted mere seconds and rarely involved formal challenges. Even the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, often romanticized as a righteous duel between law and chaos, was over in under half a minute and involved multiple shooters firing at close range, many missing their targets entirely. The participants didn't square off in a deserted street. They confronted each other in an alley near the corral, driven by an ongoing political feud rather than spontaneous bravado. Additionally, carrying firearms within many towns was regulated more strictly than people assume. Towns like Dodge City, Deadwood, and Tombstone had ordinances requiring visitors to surrender their weapons upon entering. Law enforcement, often former outlaws themselves, understood that limiting firearms in public spaces was crucial to keeping peace. Ironically, the belief in constant shootouts actually emerged decades after the Old West era had ended, thanks to Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows and later Western cinema. These portrayals aimed to dramatize frontier life for Eastern audiences and build a sense of American ruggedness, even if it meant rewriting history. When you look at actual crime records from the period, towns like Abilene or Wichita had fewer homicides annually than some modern small towns. Violence was present, but it wasn't the norm. It was a symptom of specific tensions, not a defining trait of everyday life in the West. The romanticized image we have today, with perfectly timed duels and morally clear gunmen, owes more to fiction than to the lived experience of the people who actually endured that brutal, transitional time. Number 4. Native Americans were skilled diplomats. Contrary to the simplistic and often distorted portrayals found in early films, textbooks, and media, many Native American leaders of the 19th century were deeply involved in complex political strategies that extended far beyond the battlefield. Their role in the history of the American frontier was not limited to resistance or retreat. Instead, it involved dynamic decision-making, calculated negotiations, and persistent efforts to navigate the expanding pressures of settler colonialism and federal policy. Figures such as Quanah Parker of the Comanche, Black Kettle of the Cheyenne, Washakie of the Shoshone, and Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota illustrate this reality. Quanah Parker, for example, was not only a fierce military leader during the Red River War, but later played a central role in guiding his people through the transition to reservation life, becoming an advocate for education and diplomacy, while still upholding cultural identity. Native diplomacy involved multi-level strategies, including intertribal alliances, tactical truces with the U.S. government, and even cross-cultural negotiations that used aspects of European-American legal and religious systems when advantageous. Red Cloud's war against U.S. military forces led to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, one of the few major treaties in which Native resistance achieved temporary territorial recognition. However, these leaders were not naive. They understood the limitations and risks of negotiating with a government that frequently broke promises. Their approach was often about choosing the least destructive path in an environment of limited options. These decisions were made in the face of brutal displacement, military campaigns, broken treaties, and cultural suppression. Yet tribal leaders still managed to preserve key elements of sovereignty, tradition, and identity. Their diplomatic skill is further reflected in how many native nations today have functioning governments, legal systems, and economic partnerships rooted in structures first forged during these challenging periods. To reduce Native Americans of the Old West to either warriors or victims is to ignore the sophisticated leadership that enabled many tribes to survive policies explicitly designed to erase them. Diplomacy in this context wasn't weakness. It was survival through intelligence, resilience, and long-term vision. Number 5. The Wild West. Wasn't that wild? The common belief that the American West in the late 19th century was an ungoverned, violent frontier where shootouts and lawlessness were part of daily life is more myth than historical reality. While there were certainly moments of violence, instability, and criminal activity, especially during rapid settlement and territorial expansion, most frontier towns operated with a degree of order that directly contradicts their popular image. Places like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood had functioning municipal governments, local ordinances, and structured legal systems. Many towns implemented firearm control policies requiring newcomers to check in their weapons at the sheriff's office, a practical measure to reduce bar fights and gun deaths in crowded saloons. Lawmen such as Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and Bill Tillman weren't merely legends. They were enforcers of evolving civic codes in places trying to maintain stability in a rapidly changing society. Saloons, brothels, and gambling houses existed, but they operated under regulations, paid taxes, and in some cases, even faced licensing requirements. Moreover, frontier justice often involved formal court proceedings rather than the vigilante-style hangings popularized by fiction. Newspapers were active in most towns, reporting not just crimes, but court cases, land disputes, infrastructure developments, and community events, painting a fuller picture of social life. These communities, while rough in appearance and culture, were not devoid of structure. The Wild West myth was deliberately amplified by sensationalist press and writers who wanted to captivate readers back east. These exaggerated tales helped sell books and papers, later influencing Wild West shows, and eventually the Western film genre, which solidified the idea of the lawless frontier. But data from the period tells a different story. Historical crime records show that homicide rates in many of these towns were comparable to, or even lower than in some contemporary cities. While the potential for violence was real, especially in mining camps or during land rushes, it was not the norm. Settlers, business owners, and families moved west seeking opportunity, not anarchy, and most had a vested interest in building stable, livable communities. Understanding the West as a complex space of governance, adaptation, and control, rather than an untamed battlefield, challenges one of the most deeply embedded myths in American cultural memory. Number 6. Cowboys were often non-white. The widely accepted image of the American cowboy as a rugged white man on horseback is a product of cinematic storytelling and cultural filtering, not an accurate reflection of historical demographics or social reality. In fact, racial and ethnic diversity was a defining feature of the cowboy workforce, especially in the decades following the Civil War, when ranching expanded across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and the Great Plains. An estimated 1 in 4 cowboys was African American, many of them formerly enslaved individuals who sought new beginnings and economic survival in the West's demanding labor economy. These men became skilled horsemen, cattle herders, and trail cooks, integrating into an occupation that valued toughness, experience, and resilience over race. Alongside them, Mexican vaqueros, whose cattle herding traditions had shaped the region since Spanish colonization, brought deep expertise in roping, branding, saddle making, and horsemanship. Much of what we now associate with cowboy culture originates from vaquero methods and terminology, from the lariat to the rodeo. Native Americans also contributed significantly, particularly as scouts, herders, and wranglers, often navigating dual identities between traditional life and economic necessity. Some indigenous men worked ranch jobs to support their families after being forced onto reservations, adapting their equestrian and hunting skills to cattle work. Multiracial individuals and people of mixed heritage were common in frontier territories where cultural lines blurred under the weight of survival. What unified these cowboys was not race or background, but their capacity to endure long drives, harsh climates, and unpredictable conditions. The absence of this diversity in most depictions of the Old West is not accidental. It reflects a deliberate cultural editing process that began in the early 20th century, when Western films and novels sanitized frontier history to align with dominant white American narratives. This exclusion helped build a heroic mythology centered on a white masculine archetype, erasing the real contributions of the diverse communities that made cattle ranching and frontier settlement possible. When you strip away the myths and examine employment records, personal accounts, and early photographs, the historical truth becomes clear. The cowboy was never a one-race symbol of American identity, but a reflection of a complex, multicultural labor force shaped by migration, displacement, and shared hardship. Recognizing this shifts the romanticism of the West into something more grounded, diverse, and historically accurate. Number 7. Lawmen often had criminal pasts. One of the most overlooked truths about the American Old West is how thin the line often was between those enforcing the law and those breaking it. The romantic portrayal of upright sheriffs keeping the peace in dusty frontier towns rarely captures the chaotic and morally gray world in which many of these figures operated. In many cases, the men who were hired as marshals, sheriffs, or deputies had previous histories as gamblers, con artists, or even outlaws themselves. This wasn't always seen as a disqualifier. On the contrary, having experience in the underworld often gave these men the practical edge needed to deal with hardened criminals, settle disputes, and survive violent encounters. Wyatt Earp is a textbook example. Before becoming a lawman, he had been arrested for theft, operated brothels, and worked as a gambler. Yet he rose to fame as a central figure in the gunfight at the OK Corral, and was celebrated for his supposed bravery and honor. The same contradictions are visible in the life of Wild Bill Hickok, who was both a feared gunman and a federal marshal. Hickok was involved in numerous shootouts, often provoked or fueled by personal conflicts rather than civic duty. His reputation as a lawman was closely tied to his skill with a gun, but he also lived as a gambler and was known for heavy drinking. These dual identities were not exceptions, but part of a broader pattern in frontier law enforcement, where what mattered most was the ability to control violence, not necessarily moral purity. Many small towns could not afford or attract professional law officers, so they hired men with reputations for toughness, regardless of background. At times, lawmen and outlaws even traded roles. Some notorious bandits later became deputies, either in exchange for immunity or simply because their knowledge of crime was seen as valuable. This revolving door between the law and criminality created a climate where justice was improvised and authority was often contested. It also meant that personal relationships and alliances shaped enforcement more than written laws or official codes. In a region where formal institutions were still developing, being feared was often more effective than being respected. This complex dynamic adds a layer of ambiguity to the myth of the righteous frontier hero, and suggests that power in the Old West wasn't about virtue, but about survival, intimidation, and knowing how to navigate a rough, often lawless environment with pragmatism and force. Number 8. Women were tougher than you think. The popular image of the Old West has long centered on men gunfighters, sheriffs, outlaws, and cattlemen, while relegating women to background roles such as school teachers, saloon workers, or homemakers. But this view overlooks the essential and often formidable roles women played in shaping frontier life. The American West demanded physical and emotional resilience, and many women not only met those demands, but actively challenged the restrictive gender expectations of their time. Frontier women were homesteaders who built cabins, grew crops, and defended their land, often with firearms, in the absence of husbands or male relatives. Others seized economic opportunities. Some ran boarding houses, opened general stores, or took charge of ranch operations. Figures like Calamity Jane weren't anomalies. She drank, rode, scouted for the army, and handled a gun with the confidence of any male counterpart. Likewise, Stagecoach Mary was not only the first African-American woman to work for the U.S. Postal Service, but also an intimidating figure who was known to settle disputes with her fists and carried a rifle for protection. There were also women who adopted male identities, either to serve in wars, find work, or escape rigid gender roles, blending in by changing clothes and names, sometimes for years, without detection. Others operated on the edge of legality, joining outlaw gangs or acting as accomplices in robberies, while still managing domestic responsibilities. These women weren't simply filling gaps. They were driving frontier expansion and survival in their own right. Their participation in community building, healthcare, education, and local governance was essential in stabilizing many early settlements. Despite being largely written out of the dominant Western narrative, they contributed equally to the West's development under harsh, lawless, and unforgiving conditions. The strength they displayed wasn't ornamental or symbolic. It was physical, strategic, and unflinching. Their lives were shaped by the same demands as their male peers, and often required even more ingenuity, as they navigated a culture that simultaneously depended on and underestimated them. Their legacy remains embedded in land rights battles, educational initiatives, and even early suffrage movements that found fertile ground in the frontier before reaching the coasts. Understanding the Old West without them presents a distorted, incomplete picture of a region where survival wasn't a male privilege, but a human challenge answered with courage by women as much as men. Number 9. Cattle drives were miserable. The romanticized image of the cattle drive, where sun-kissed cowboys ride heroically across endless plains beneath golden skies, is a cinematic illusion that omits the exhausting and often brutal nature of the work. In truth, cattle drives were grueling, dangerous, and monotonous endeavors that tested the physical and mental endurance of everyone involved. Cowboys worked up to 18 or even 20 hours a day, with shifts rotating around the clock to keep the herd moving and prevent stampedes, especially at night when a sudden sound could send hundreds of longhorns charging blindly. The terrain was unforgiving. Dust storms, flash floods, deep rivers, and intense heat were constant hazards. Rain turned trails into mud pits, while droughts turned waterholes into dust bowls. Cowboys rode through snake-infested grasses, dealt with biting insects, and suffered from saddle sores and sunburn. Food was basic and repetitive beans, biscuits, and salted beef, often cooked over open fires in unsanitary conditions. Clean water was rare, hygiene was minimal, and bathing was a luxury they rarely experienced. Sleep came in short bursts, often on the hard ground, with nothing but a blanket and a saddle for a pillow. Equipment had to be maintained constantly, and horses rotated or treated for exhaustion and injury. Pay was low, typically between $30 and $40 a month, barely enough to justify the risk of injury, disease, or death. Yet despite the hardship, the role demanded technical skill. Managing the herd's pace, keeping cattle from straying, controlling the group during river crossings, and navigating unfamiliar, often contested land. Cowboys needed to be expert riders, quick thinkers, and capable of working in tightly coordinated teams. The job also had social and psychological tolls. Cowboys lived in isolation for weeks or months, with little contact beyond their immediate crew. Emotional resilience was as essential as physical toughness. Far from the heroic lifestyle seen in pop culture, cattle driving was unforgiving labor, shaped by economic necessity more than frontier freedom. Those who endured it were driven not by adventure, but by survival, the promise of a wage, and the hope of a better future, making their contribution to the cattle industry and to the mythos of the American West all the more grounded in sweat, grit, and relentless endurance. Number 10. The end of the Old West came fast. Despite the way it dominates American mythology, the era we think of as the Old West was actually brief, intense, and over far sooner than most people realize. By the time the 20th century began, many of the key elements that defined frontier life, open cattle ranges, lawless boomtowns, high-profile outlaws, and violent frontier conflicts had already faded into history. The rapid spread of the railroad played a central role in this transformation. With transcontinental routes established by the 1880s, vast stretches of previously remote territory became accessible, quickly linking frontier settlements to industrialized cities and markets. As connectivity grew, Mobility increased, but so did federal oversight. The government extended its reach into these territories by installing modern law enforcement, federal courts, and military presence to manage both settler disputes and conflicts with indigenous nations. At the same time, technological developments like barbed wire revolutionized ranching. Open-range grazing, once central to the cowboy way of life, gave way to fenced property and private land use, severely limiting the freedom cowboys once had. Without the long drives or vast open spaces, the role of the cowboy shifted from adventurous cattle herder to seasonal ranch laborer. Meanwhile, Native American tribes, who had long resisted U.S. expansion, were increasingly confined to reservations, stripped of autonomy, land, and traditional ways of life under a series of assimilation policies. Many famous outlaws, whose names once filled newspapers and dime novels, were killed, captured, or faded into obscurity as law enforcement became more structured and far-reaching. Figures like Butch Cassidy, Jesse James, and Billy the Kid were gone or in hiding, replaced by modern criminals and organized gangs in urban areas. Yet even as the actual Old West was vanishing, its image was taking on a second life. Wild West shows like those of Buffalo Bill turned real frontier figures into theatrical icons, performing dramatized battles and cowboy acts for Eastern and European audiences. These performances created a version of the West that was more legend than truth cleaner, more heroic, and far less complicated than reality. This mythologizing only deepened with the arrival of Hollywood, where Westerns became a dominant genre by the 1930s, cementing the cowboy, the outlaw, and the frontier sheriff as archetypes of American identity. What's remarkable is how quickly this shift happened. In the span of just a few decades, a turbulent, often violent and diverse historical period was flattened into a symbol of rugged individualism, even though by the early 1900s, much of that life had already disappeared. The true end of the Old West was not marked by a final gunfight or a dramatic last stand, but by a slow, bureaucratic, and industrial absorption of land and people into a modern nation-state. What lingers today is the myth endlessly retold, but largely disconnected from the complex, often uncomfortable truths of what really happened in the American frontier.